Good morning.
Boker Tov. Today's daf is Daf Yud Zayin in Zbachim as Milim Prachenu Kol Beis Yisrael and Son of Asar V'Shivya. The Gemara Chsim Tov to everyone. Says the Gemara at the second line on Daf Yud Zayin Alf Tful Yom. What is that? The Mishnah said again the people who are puzzled to do the avoda, meaning Kabbalah specifically, but also Halacha and Zrika. Those who were puzzled, number one, a Zar non-Kohen. Number two, an Onain, a person whose next of kin died that day. So those we discussed yesterday, Zar and an Onain. Today we'll discuss the next two. Tful Yom. Tful Yom is a person who had to go to the mikveh because he was Tameh. He could have been Tameh because he touched a dead reptile. The eight reptiles were Matami when you're dead. Touched a nevela, carcass of an animal. Could have attended a funeral of a human being. Then he'd be Tameh for 7 days. After you go to the mikveh, you have to wait for sundown. That's called a Tful Yom. Who went to the mikveh that day, he has to wait for sundown. Now we'll see that that's a Tful Yom. What's a Mechusar Kippurim? Example would be a Zav or a Mitzora, who were Tameh in themselves. In other words, it's called a Tumah Yotzei Gufo. They were not Tameh because they touched a dead body or attended a funeral, or touched a reptile, or touched something they shouldn't have touched, a carcass of an animal, but rather the Tameh, the tumah, the defilement emanated from their own body. That's more stringent. Those kinds of tumah, even though they went to the mikveh after 7 days or whatever the time period was, they went to the mikveh and waited for sundown, they still have to bring a carbon the next day. That's called the Mechusar Kippurim. He doesn't have a full atonement till then. So either it's Tful Yom or Mechusar Kippurim cannot perform avodah. They cannot officiate in the Beis Hamikdash, do any avodas, do anything at all. That's what we said, Tful Yom and Mechusar Kippurim. Now, how do we know? Now, there's many halachas about Tful Yom. They're not supposed to do the avodah, but also they can't eat truma. Let's say there's all kinds of isurim that they have, but they are partially purified. They went to the mikveh, but you still have to wait for Har Shemesh. Okay, so how do we know that a person who's at Tful Yom who hasn't yet had sundown, he went to the mikveh that day, but he hasn't had sun? How do we know that if he does the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash that he also profanes the avodah? Minoan says the Gemara in the third line on Yitzayim. The time of Samayom or Remez at Tful Yom she'im avet chilul. How do we know? What's the hint in the Torah? That if he did the avodah, he profaned it, he ruined the avodah, meaning he ruined the animal, the sacrifice, it's all no good, it's disqualified. Minayin, Talmud Lomar, Kedoshim yiyu v'lo yechalu. Beginning Kedosh says, Kedoshim, you should be holy, you priests, v'lo yechalu, and don't profane it. Like you're invalid, you're disqualified, you're tameh. How? How do we know? Emmanuel, you need a tameh. You don't need it to tell me a person who's mamish tameh, who's been defiled but hasn't gone to the mikveh at all. Why? We already learned that the other day. 2 days ago we had the Nazru. How do we know that a person? The pasuk says also at the beginning of it says the Nazru mikash mishra. That's actually written afterwards in Perek Chafbeis. The Nazru mikache b'nei Yisrael v'echal. So we said b'nei Yisrael v'echal teach me zar. But the Nazru, if you're tamei, separate and don't do any avodah. So we already know tamei from the Nazru. So therefore, what does Kedoshim you teach me? What are you telling me from? Even it's Tful Yom, where you're not as tamei as you were before. You went to the mikvah, but you still haven't had Har Shemesh. You haven't yet shkia yet, and therefore him. So that's what the pasuk is for. Kedoshim you v'lo yechalu. Says the Gemara, that pasuk of Kedoshim you v'lo yechalu, which is where in Vayikra Chaf Aleph, I had it marked the other day here. Pardon? In Kedoshim. Kedoshim, yeah.
In the little fridge at the bottom, there is the sodas. Can you just bring me one from the bottom? Seltzer, any one of them.
So how do we know? It says like this. It says, this is in Perek Chaf Aleph, right? Kedoshim Yiu. What is it? When does it say that? The prior pasuk says, listen, you Kohanim, right? Debril Kohanim. It's an Emor, not right. Emor, you're right. It's not in the Kedoshim. In Emor, tells to the Kohanim. Don't become tamei. You can't come into your next of kin, etc., etc. Lo yikhu karcha b'roshim. Don't make any bald spots. In other words, they used to, when people were mourning, people used to shave, to pull their hair out. They should make themselves. Don't do that. Also, they shouldn't shave their faces, with a razor. So they shouldn't cut themselves. And then it says Kedoshim yiyu le'Eloheihem v'lo yichalu shem Eloheihem ki eskesh Shem lechem Eloheihem heimakim kodesh. So maybe Kedoshim Yiyu Leilem V'lecho, this pasuk we just say Kedoshim Yiyu, maybe it's going on those Isurim that if you don't pull your hair out, don't shave, don't do those kind of things, don't shave on your face, don't take a razor to your face. Maybe it's that, says the Gemara, Ema tanu inyan l'koreach karcha. Maybe that's what it means. If you're a koreach karcha, if you did those things, will a mashkas pas zakan, or if you take a razor to your face, maybe that's what it's speaking about, that you should be holy, and if you do those things, you profane the avoda. Gemara says, no, Tful Yom, I'll tell you why it refers to Tful Yom. The pasuk just says, Kedoshim Yiyu v'lo yichalu. How do we know it refers to Tful Yom? The im avad b'misa minoam. How do we know that it's Tful Yom, that if he did the avoda, he is killed for that, he's going to be chayiv misa, let's say misa b'dei shamayim, minoam, the gomer chil mitruma. Actually, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, how do you know that a Tful Yom does the avoda, that he's chayiv misa? Because it says here, lo kedoshim yiyu v'lo yichalu, and by truma it says if they eat truma, they're also going to machalal the truma, they're profane the truma. And just like there, if they eat truma in a state of tuma, they are chayiv misa. The same thing over here too. In other words, the lo yichalu, we don't know it. It says kedoshim yiyu v'lo yichalu. Is it referring to a person who pulled his hair out? Is it a person who shaves? Is it a person who's a full yom? But the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, how do you know? How do you know that a person who's at full yom who ate truma? There the pasuk says, if you're at full yom and you ate truma, you're chayiv misa. So we learn out over here chil from truma. There's this pasuk as kedoshim yiyu v'lo yichalu tells us that idea. Rashi right over here where we're even says shinu klomar. You can't use it for kochad. The misa gabe tful yom she'avad. How do we know that that he's chayiv misa if he did the avoda? Chayiv misa. We're not even talking about the avoda because you learn out v'gomer chil mitruma. When we chil the high cry yalef of this very pasuk, never can chil v'nemer betame b'tful yom she'achlu truma chilul. It says if a tame or a tful yom ate truma v'chilul. It says umesabo kachilul. So just like over there it's misa, here also it's misa. Just like if you ate truma, you chayiv misa. If you did the avoda, you chayiv misa. In other words, they use this very pasuk to tell me kedoshim yiyu v'lo yichalu. Tell me that a person who's at full yom who did the avoda is chayiv misa. So therefore, we're talking about a person who's not allowed to eat truma. Therefore, the Gemara goes on back in the Gemara. The possible truma machalavoda. So therefore, we say the person who's not allowed to eat truma, based on this gzeira shava of chilul, he can't. The one who can't eat, right? Because there we're talking about a person who can't eat truma. That's a full yom, and he's chayiv misa. Right? The same way, if he did the avoda over here, this is also referring to its full yom, who did the avoda is also chayiv misa. So the possible truma machalavoda, the low possible truma lo machalavoda. In other words, the one who's can't eat truma and he's chayiv death if he eats truma. In the same way, we say the Skever Shava teaching me that if he did the avoda, he's chayiv death. The same way we say the one who can't eat truma, he's the one who's machal devoda, and the one who's not possibly truma, person who tore his hair out or shaved did an aveira, but he's not machal the avoda there. Because why? Because he's not possible to eat truma. Person who's tame or a tful yom cannot eat truma on punishment of death. That misbei shemayim. So there we say the one who's possible, just like so. Therefore, we say that the lo yichal, the Gemara in Kedushin in Sanhedrin says kedoshim yiyu v'lo yichal refers to a person who ate truma while a person who's ate full yom, because again the chilul the gzeira shava says just like over there, if a person who ate truma in a state of tuma and full yom is chayiv misa. The same thing over here. The tful yom is chayiv misa if he did the avoda. How do we know he's machal the avoda? Because we're speaking about a person who can't eat truma. The possible truma, a person who can't eat truma, meaning it's tful yom, he's machal the avoda. The one who's not possible to eat truma, like a person who just shaved badly or tore his hair out, he's not machal the avoda. So therefore, this pasuk of kedoshim yiyu v'lo yichal teaches me that at tful yom also, if he did the avoda, he's machal the avoda. He ruins the avoda. Amar Rabba. Why do we need all these psukim? We mentioned in the Mishnah that Azar onain full yom mechusar kippurim etc. And it's going to say tamei also. Why do we need a pasuk by tamei? Now why do we need a pasuk? Why do we need all these psukim to teach me that if you did the avoda in any of these three states, you're chayiv, you're machal the avoda, you ruin the avoda. Amar Rabba. Why does he have to say by all three of them? They're all similar, right? Person who's basically tummy, a person who went to the mikvah already, a person who went to the mikvah had Rav Shapiro. Why do you tell me all three of them that if you did the avoda, you're machal the avoda? Why do you tell me all three? Now Rashi points out that atame, Rashi 4 or 5 lines before the lines get wide, atame lo kamil. He's not asking about tame. If it wouldn't be say tame, we would say that this pasuk of kedoshim yiyu v'lo yichal is referring to tame. right? How do we know Tomei? Because it says v'inozru, right? But he's not really asking on that, because that basically, the only reason you know the other two is because you have the v'inozru teaches me Tomei, so the other ones are learned out by Imein or Inyan or Mechusik Kippurim, as we'll see later on how that's learned out. It doesn't say exactly chilul over there. We learned out of a pasuk. So how do you know chilul? You learned out basically the Tomei. So he's really asking, once you know that Tomei, that a person who's Tomei is machal the avoda, a kohen who's Tomei is machal avoda, why do I need the other psukim, a special pasuk for Tful Yom and Mechusik Kippurim? Can't we learn it out from Tomei? So the Gemara says Shrichim. Because Rachman Atam can only say the pasuk of Tomei, which we said is what the Nazru, or he said there's other ways to learn out also from Mitzvah Shava, but the basic pasuk, let's say, is V'inazru. If it would only say Tamei, Shekem Tamei. Tamei is more stringent than a Tful Yom who already went to the mikveh or Mechus Kippurim, because a Tamei is Matami other things. He defiles other people or other items. So therefore, you can't learn out the other ones from Tamei. But Tful Yom, if we would only say by Tful Yom, like this pasuk that we just had of Kedoshim Yiv V'lo Yachal, who teaching me Tful Yom, Mechusik Kippurim lost me. Wouldn't be able to chasur. Why? Shekain Poso B'Truma. A Tful Yom is not eat Truma. Mechusik Kippurim could eat Truma. Whereas if a Tful Yom ate Truma, he's Chayiv Misa, and he's not allowed to eat Truma. Okay, so you can't learn out Mechusik Kippurim from Tful Yom. So let it say by Mechusik Kippurim. Let it just say Mechusik Kippurim is Mechal the Avoda. We'll see it on the base why Mechusik Kippurim is Mechal the Avoda. We'll see that later on. Right? If we want to say by Mechusik Tful Yom lo asim, why should Mechusar Maisa? Mechusar Kippurim still has to do something. He's got to, what does he have to do? He has to bring a carbon. Okay. So since he still has to do a maisa, he has to do a positive act. He's lacking that positive act. That's why his avoda is mechulal if he does it. Whereas a Tful Yom has to do nothing. Sheval Tasa, Tful Yom went to the mikveh. All he's got to do is wait for Erev Shemesh. He doesn't have to do anything. So maybe he wouldn't passel the avoda. Therefore, we have to say all three. Okay. So the Gemara says, Michada lo asi. You can't learn out the other two or either one from one of them. Okay, maybe you could learn out one from two. Again, it says that there's a pasuk that tells me by Tomei, there's a pasuk by Tful Yom, and a pasuk by Mechusik Kippurim. Why do we need all three? Learn out one from the other two. Okay, but hey, lo lichtov Rachmana. In which case do you want to leave out and learn that one from the other two? Lo lichtov Mechusik Kippurim. Let it not say by Mechusik Kippurim that a Mechusik Kippurim is Mechal the Avoda. Learn from Tamei and Tful Yom. The other two can't eat Truma. As we said, they're disqualified from eating Truma, both the Tamei and a Tful Yom. So don't say it by Tful Yom, and learn from the other two. Learn Tful Yom from a combination of Tamei and Mechusik Kippurim. My prachas, what are you going to ask? A Tamei has to go to the mikveh, and a Mechusik Kippurim has to bring a carbon. But self kalisha la tumasan. But the tumah of Mechusik Kippurim, what do you want to say? That don't say lo lech rachmana b'tful yom and learn it out from Mechusik Kippurim and from Tamei. And what are you going to say? Well, they're Mechusar Maisa. Even though the Mechusik Kippurim is Mechusar Maisa, but it's already gone to the mikveh and had hair of shemesh. The Mechusik Kippurim is a guy who already went to the mikveh. He was at Tful Yom. He waited for sundown, so he's got that purification. And therefore his tumah is much weaker in a way, right? The Tful Yom still has to wait for Harav Shemesh. The Mechusik Kippurim already had Harav Shemesh. So therefore, he has to bring a carbon the next day, but his tumah is weaker. So therefore, you could say that a Tful Yom, you should be able to learn out Tful Yom from the other two. What are you going to say? Well, the Tamei still has to go to the mikveh, and what? And the Mechusik Kippurim still has to bring a carbon, but he's got a weaker tumah already, and therefore you could learn it out from Mechusik Kippurim. If a Mechusik Kippurim who already went to the mikveh, if he's Mechal the Avodah, certainly it's Tful Yom who has to still wait for Harav Shemesh. Rashi, 2 lines from the bottom of the page. Klishle Tumaso, the Mechusik Kippurim has a weaker tumah because Sharei Harav Shemesh. He already had mikveh and Harav Shemesh. You can't ask the Malat Tzadad the Chavin are not Mishen Mechusar Maisa because you want to say that those two are Mechusar Meiser. He's not really Mechusar Maisa because he's already gone to the mikveh and had Harav Shemesh. The answer is, says Gemara, the reason you can't learn out Tful Yom from the other two, even though you might say that Tful Yom has a stronger tumah because he has to wait for Harav Shemesh and Mechusik already have Shemesh. Except Mechusik Kippurim dezav kazav dami. You know what he says? He holds that it mentioned at the beginning of the Shiur that a Zav and a Metzora, right, are two that even though they went to the mikveh after 7 days, etc., and they had Erev Shemesh, they have to bring a carbon the next day. Okay, so therefore you might say their tumah is pretty much already cleaned up. They went to the mikvah, and they had Erev Shemesh. But he says the mechusik of Azav, he says Anna Mitzorah, Rashi says Anna Mitzorah also. There are other people who have to bring a carbon, and Nazir has to bring a carbon, etc. But these two, Zav Mitzorah, a mechusik Yippurim is like as it's like as he haven't gone to the mikveh yet. It's much more stringent, right? As we said, it's a tumah that emanates from his body. It's not a tumah that you contracted the tumah by attending a funeral or touching somebody that's dead or touching a reptile or something, a dead reptile, right? He holds that mechusik Yippurim of Azav is like a Zav Dami. It's as if he hasn't gone to the mikveh. Therefore, you can't learn out full Yom from mechusik Yippurim and what? And Tameh, right? Because he says she came mechusar Maisa, right? And even though, right, the Tameh hasn't gone to the mikveh yet, and the Tful Yom has gone to the mikveh, at Tful Yom, what about mechusik Yippurim? Mechusik Yippurim has gone to the mikveh? Yes, but if he's a mechusik Yippurim of a Zav, and it starts as if he hasn't gone to the mikveh yet. Well, Ksav mechusik Yippurim to Zav is Kazav Dami. Says Rashi, the top line, Ksav Rabbah, the Darshal Hashmaita, remember the Kulsar, you eat all of them, you can't learn out Tful Yom from the other two. Who had the Mitzorah? It's Zav or Mitzorah. Elachad ben Aynaka. Mechusik Yippurim to Zav Kazav Dami Inyan Kachim. Shelo Hutter Etzlo. He's not allowed to eat them. It's as if he wasn't tovel. That's why I should say tovel. V'imachol chayiv koros. You chayiv koros. O im nagabu tamen is metame them to metame rishon v'sheni. In other words, even metame makes it a rishon, and a rishon can make a sheni. Therefore, it's not really weaker at all, and therefore you can't learn out full yom from mechusik Yippurim and tamei, because both of them are as if they haven't gone to the mikveh yet. Tamei for sure hasn't gone to the mikveh, that's why he's Tamei. And the mechusik Yippurim of the Zav, it's as if he hasn't gone to the mikveh. Even though he went to the mikveh and he had Erev Shemesh, it's as if he hasn't gone to the mikveh when it comes to his Zav Mitzorah. Therefore, you can't learn out full yom from them because they are really mechusar Maisa, whereas at full yom is not mechusar Maisa. The Rashash and others point out, if that's the case, you could have said this answer before too. When you said before, why can't you learn out full yom from mechusik Yippurim? Because mechusik Yippurim is missing a ma'isa. Now we're saying that's not really like it's missing a ma'isa. But all right, the kasha is better than the answers that they give. The Moshash doesn't even answer it. Mechusik Yippurim now adds on mechusik Yippurim to Zav Kazav means actually machlokas tanoami. Where the Tanya. Now a paraduma, was burnt is not like regular kachim mizbeach. It's called kachim berek abayis. It has certain kedusha. In fact, it has to be done by a kohen. A regular, it's got different rules. Kachim mizbeach, even though it's more holy in a sense because it's kachim mizbeach, it's kedusha zaguf. But a zar can shecht it. Not when it comes to paradum, has to be done all by the kohen. So the Tanya sarfa, he has to. Let's say the kohen who burnt it sarfa onein mechusik Yippurim. If the person was a person who's next of kin at that day, or he didn't have yet a kapara, he didn't bring his carbon that is necessary, needs the kohen. Kshera, it's kosher. It's not like a regular carbon that you bring in the mizbeach, like a chatas or an osham or whatever. Not like that. It's kosher. It's kosher, right? So Rashi says, "Paraduma kshera the kosher berekabayisi." They know an osarba. The loksiv hanach kroy elav kosher mizbeach. The psukim that we've discussed about an onein, right? And a mechusar, and we're going to talk about a mechusar Yippurim, but an onein we talked already before. The zar, the zar can't do a paraduma either, but. And if the Kohen's an onein and mechusik Yippurim, it's kosher. Even a mechusik Yippurim by Kohen and mechusik Yippurim of an onein cannot do regular abode in the base of Mikdash, but for the paraduma they're allowed to. Yosef a Bavli Omer onein sheira. You're right when it comes to onein mechusik Yippurim sula. If he still was lacking a carbon, if he was a zav or a mitzorah and didn't bring his carbon yet, is possible to do the avoda of the paraduma. My lab al-kamifli. What's machlokas? They're arguing by mechusik Yippurim. Right, my love. The second one who says what? That is like a zav. That says the second one who says meaning Yosef Babli says mechusik Yippurim is puzzle. You know why? Because the mechusik Yippurim of a zav is like a zav. It's as if he hasn't gone to the mikveh yet, so he can't do the paraduma. Umar Saba, the Tanakamu says no mechusik Yippurim by a kohen doing the paraduma could do it. Lav kazav dami. It's not kazav. That's the machlok. It says it was low. The kuliyama kazav dami. Everybody holds like Rabbah. That mechusik Yippurim of a zav, it's like a zav mamish zav. It's as if he hasn't gone to the mikveh again because of the chumrah of zav that it's a tumah that emanates from his body. What's machlokas here? It says The pasuk says v'hiza hator. See, when it comes to the whole avodah the paraduma, it's a whole process, right? Beginning of chukas. That I got that parsha right, Michael. It's in chukas, right? Right. The kulam kazav dami. Ulinian shar kachim shitful yom asabu having mechusik kipurim. When it comes to other kachim, mechusik kipurim zav is like a when it comes to other kachim, mechusik is like a zav, and it's more stringent than a full yom. The chomer mitful yom the shar tumas shein tumas kapara. It's more chomer than that. Because a tful yom of other kaparas, once he went to the mikveh, just has to wait for Rav Shemesh. But a mechusik kipurim of Azov, it's as if he hasn't gone to the mikveh yet. I'm reading Rashi. It says the pasuk visa atar altame koldu. In other words, the pasuk is visa atar. Why did it say atar? The pasuk already said v'lokach ezov. We should take the hyssop, the tavel b'mayim ish tahor. Who is the one who purifies the person who's tamei mace? That's the whole purpose of the paraduma. It's matah, the person who's tamei mace. The ishtar, a person who's already pure, he's the one who has to dip it in water. The Kohen dips it in the water, etc., etc. He does the avodah and sprinkles it on the guy. And then the pasuk is v'hizatar. What do you mean v'hizatar? Of course, it already said that the Kohen who's tahor dips the hyssop in there, and he sprinkles. Then it says v'hizatar, and the tahor Kohen has to sprinkle it again. Has to sprinkle. Why does he have to call him a tahor? Just say v'hiza. Just say you already said the taval v'lakach. Ezav v'tova ma'im ish tahor. You already said ish tahor. Why does the next pasuk have to say, or the same pasuk have to say v'hiza tahor, to tell me that he's a little bit tummy? You're emphasizing, you're pleading too much, right? You call him again v'hiza tahor, meaning mechlav shu tummy. Again, he calls him a tar. You already called him a tar. Why do you call him a tar? Because he's a tar, but he's not 100% tar. As if to tell you he's a little bit tar, but he's a little bit tummy too. V'hiza tar, mechlav shu tummy. He's a little bit tummy. What are we speaking about? Limit al tful yom shekasher vara. Al tful yom is kosher by paraduma. Okay, kosher paraduma. That's what he learns. That they're discussing this pasuk. Mar savar tumrachol atar kula. Any tful yom, even a tful yom of a zav. In other words, they both hold rest that mechusik kipurim of a zav is like a zav, meaning it's like he didn't go to the mikveh. However, when it comes to this pasuk of paraduma, which isn't kachim mizbeach, it's kachim berekabayis, the pasuk says v'hiza hatar. He's not 100% tar. He's tar, but I'm telling you he's tar, but he's not really tar. He's got a little bit of tuma. He's a tful yom. Shu tame. He's a tame. Lehiman tful yom. Shekosher. He's part of duma. Mar sabar. In other words, the Tanakama who says that what then mechusik kipurim could also do the avoda of the paraduma. Mar sabar tuma nechol kula. Any tuma, even zav. If he's a tful yom of a zav, special pasuk tells us he's allowed to do the paraduma. Mar savar tumadach parsha. No. What kind of a tumah are we speaking about that he's at full yom of this parsha? What's the parsha paraduma speaking about? What kind of a tumah? Tumas mes, right? Tumas mes doesn't have it doesn't have to mechusik kipurim. He doesn't bring a carbon. You sprinkle him on the 3rd and 7th days, right? He stays tar, and he goes to the mikvah on the 7th day, and that's it. He waits for Rav Shemesh, and that's it. Mar savar tumadach parsha. We're speaking of who is the ishtar, who is the Kohen, who's a little bit pure, but he's not 100%. He's a tful yom. Who is this guy? He's a guy who's a tful yom, but he doesn't need mechusik. He's not a mechusik kipurim. In this parsha, it's just like he's purifying a guy who is tamei mace. We're talking about the Kohen also, who is being purified from his tamei mace. He's on the 7th day. He went to the mikvah. He didn't have Rav Shemesh yet. He's a tful yom. He could do the avodah of the paraduma. Only of that parsha. Okay, but not if he's a zav. If he was a zav and still needs to bring a kapara the next day, is a mechusik kipurim of a zav, wouldn't be good. Why? Because we said mechusik kipurim of a zav is like a zav. The Tanakama says yes, but by this pasuk, by paradum, we have a special pasuk says v'hiza tar. The guy who's a tful yom, he's a tar. He's a tful yom. What? Right? He's a tful. Any tful yom, even if he's a zav, he could do the avod of the paraduma, even though he can't do the avod in the base of Mikdash. Umar savar. Right, but Rav Yossi Abavli says in mechusar kipurim of a zav cannot do the avod of the paraduma. He holds tumah dach parsha. What's kind of a tful yom could do? They can sprinkle the guy who's tamei mace. Who can do that? The one of this parsha, like a tamei mace, is tamei 7 days. Hilkach oneinu tful yom, an onen of a yom the tamei sheretz, who are only tamei for how long? 1 day. An onen is only 1 day. and a full yom tamei sheretz is only for 1 day. The kili, they are more less stringent, they are more lenient because they're only they don't cover chomet full yom the mace. If it's full yom of a mace, which is more stringent because he's tamei for 7 days, if he could do the avoda of the paraduma, certainly somebody who's only tamei 1 day. Abba mechusik yipurim dezav, which is the chomer, right, which is more stringent, and he has to bring a carbon on the 8th day. Again, here the Gemara tells us why is it more stringent, because the tumah emanates from his body. It's not something that he contracted from something else. Lo, that wouldn't work, and that's Yosef Abavli. So therefore, everybody holds that tumah that mechus like Rabbah that mechus kipurim dezav is like a zav dummy. The question is, how do you learn this pasuk by paraduma? So that's the case of what of now we've discussed 3 cases in the Mishnah: the zar, the onain, and the tful yom. Right, that if they do any avoda in the base of Mikdash, they profane it. The next one is mechusar begadif. If a Kohen doesn't have all his clothes, how many clothes does a Kohen wear? If he's a Kohen hedyo, 4 clothes, right? And if he has less than that, we'll see later on. If it's tomorrow's stuff, we'll see. Even if he has more than that, it's also no good. It's got to have exactly 4, not 3. Mechusar means he doesn't have all the clothes, so he has 3 or 2 or 1, right? The Kohen Gadol has to have 8. If he has 5, 6, or 7 or less, no good. If he has more, it's also no good. But we're talking about he's missing bottom. How do we know? Mechusar begadim and on. Where do we know that a mechusar begadim, if he doesn't have all his clothes, that he profanes the avoda? So the pasuk says like this. Pasuk says, Amar Rabbavu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. They said name Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon, son say name Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon. The pasuk says in Shmos, I'm quoting now, v'chagarto some avnei, right? It's banav. First, we talked about the Kohen Gadol. He's got to wear all the clothes, right? All 8 clothes. What about Banav? What about Aaron's children, the regular Kohanim? Going to put them on shirts, whatever we call them, tunics. Give him a belt, a girdle, whatever. Tie him up with the belt. Aaron Aaron and his sons. Put on hats. You got to wear hats, nice hats. And then they will be priests for a law forever. There's the key words. We're going to talk about chukas olam, and it says, and they will be a kohen. Meaning, when you put on their clothes, then they're kohen. Somebody asked us the other day, if he doesn't have his clothes, what is he? He's a zar. Even though genetically he's a kohen. His father was a kohen. His grandfather was a kohen. His great-father was a kohen. Right? He's a kohen. But if he doesn't have his clothes on, he's not a kohen. That's what the pasuk says. Bisman should be damn if they have their clothes on, then they're priests. And if they don't have their clothes on, all right, so that's very simple. There's not a Kohen. Very simple. What is he then? A Zar. How do we know that a Zar can't do the avoda if he did it? We had that the other day. A Zar is either from Venus or Bnei Yisrael. We learned that from we already learned that was the first one. A Zar, if he does the avoda, ruins it. Well, a Kohen who doesn't have his clothes is also a Zar. Okay. And he goes to live. Says Gemara, you learn it from this pasuk of I have a different drasha. We learn how do we know that if a guy's drunk, Kohen is drunk, that if he did the avoda, pasuk says if he's drunk and he does the avoda, below yamusu, it says he's going to die, right? Says if you come in drunk into the base mikdash and do the avoda, you're going to die. It says so. Here it says, how do you know? How do we know not only that he's going to die, but she'im avad he was mechal the avoda. Talmud Lomik pasuk says yayin v'sheichor al teish, right, Michael? Bevoachem el moed v'lo samusu. And then the next pasuk says we'll have the ben hakodesh ben achol, because if you do the not only you're going to die, but if you did the avoda that way, you've profaned it. That's good. The avoda is only kodesh if you do it while you are not drunk, right? While you are clear-minded, right? So that's that. So this is the Bryce. The Bryce says, how do you know Shtuyayin if he did the avoda? We know that he dies because it says you're going to die. How do we know that if he's machal avoda? Because the next one is lav ben koshchol. Mechusa begadim shlachas yidayim b'reglayim menayin. The Bryce goes on to say, how do you know that if he's a different pasuk, then you have a different drasha for if he doesn't have his clothes that he's like a zar? How do you know mechusa begadim shlachas yidayim? How do you know that if he's not have his clothes or he didn't wash his hands and feet from the kior, from the special container in the base of Mikdash, from the special laver, whatever they call that? How do you know that also is machalo the avoda, right? How do we know? In all 3 places, we just quoted the pasuk by by the clothing. It says clothing, but some of it says the chukas olam. And over here by the yayin, it also says yayin. It says chukas olam. We already quoted the pasuk chukas olam. And by washing your hands and feet, Rashi says in the second line, chukas olam. In all three cases, say chuka. So what do you see? How do you know that a mechus b'gonim is no good? If he doesn't vote, it ruins it. You said that pasuk in Shmos v'chagarta samavnei, but the brisa, we have a brisa which says you learn it out from yain v'shecher. It says yain v'shecher you're machal the avoda, and chukas ulam chukas chukas says it there. So you must know. If you will learn it from the pasuk of shtuya yain, what's the rule there? You chayv misa if you did shtuya yain. Right, so I might think only when you're machal the avoda, only an avoda that a zar dies on, because the pasuk talks about dying if you did the avoda, if you did the avoda while you were drunk. Aval avoda the ein zar chayv lemisa. Look, we learned that a zar cannot do the avoda, right? You can't do kabbalah, halacha, zrik, you can't do anything. Does he die if he did the kabbalah? No. Rashi quotes this case. Look at Rashi in the third of the narrow lines. There's only 4 avodas that if a zar does them, he's chayiv misa. Zika stam, that's the 4th of the regular animal, shchit kabbalah zika. Haktara, if he burns any parts of the animal on the mizbeach. Nisa chamayim v'yayin, or if he does libation on the water of the yayin on the mizbeach. Those 4 avodas he's not allowed to do. It's learned out of psukim. It's only things that he's doing something. Zrika, like putting something on, putting the sprinkling, burning, pouring the wine and the yayin, and it's got to be an avoda that's complete. That's not an interim, thing like Kabbalah or halacha. It's an interim. The whole purpose of them is to get them to the mizbeach. Those are interim. Those are not final. So he says, if I learn that from the pasuk of shtuya yayin, havi amina, hanimili avoda does our chayv lemisa, like the case of shtuya is chayv misa. Aval avoda dein chayv lemisa, like Kabbalah or halacha. I might think that a zar is not machalo that. If we were based on the pasuk of yayin, I would say, if it's on a avoda that a zar dies on, then if a kohen does that, he's chayav misa. If it does that, he's machal the avoda based on chuka. But if it's an avoda that a zar does not die for doing, like Kabbalah or halacha, a zar ruins it, but he doesn't die for that. I might think that in these cases that like the mechusar begadim would not ruin it. Only if it's something that a zar would die on, then it's machal the avoda. But if something that a zar wouldn't die, like Kabbalah, I would think that if a kohen does it without all his clothes, without all the proper clothing, I may think doesn't know kamash malon that it ruins the avoda in all cases. And as the pasuk of Chagarto Sam Avnei, our Navana, the first pasuk tells us, if he doesn't have his clothes on, he's not a kohen. He's not a kohen, he's a zar. And a zar ruins the avoda, even Kabbalah halacha. Based on the yayin shecher, I wouldn't know. So the Gemara says, okay, fine, Ashkan mechutz Kippurim. That's a mechutz Kippurim that ruins the avoda. Shtuya yayin. Let's go back now. Shtuya yayin menon. Shtuya yayin. If he drinks it, he's only chayiv misa. If he drank it, let's say if he did the avoda that way. But how do I know that shtuya yayin, if he did halacha or Kabbalah, that it also ruins it? Asi chuka kuka. We go back to this chuka mechutz begadim. Tana learned it out from Lahavdil. He learned out that it's based on Lahavdil, not based on the Gzeir Shav. He learned it out from the pasuk of Lahavdil. From there, that you know that the avoda is mechulal. That's what he said. The Brisa said, "How do I know shemavad chilo tamla from Lahavdil?" The answer is kanasavah. He learned from there. That's makam like Gzeir Shava. In other words, before he had the Gzeir Shava, he said, "How do I know shtuya ruins the avoda?" You learn it out from the pasuk of Shem. But once he had the Gzeir Shava teaching me from mechusar Kippurim, ruins the avoda in all cases, whatever avoda he did, and we learn Stein from there. That's before he had the Gzeir Shava. But the Tana learned mechusar begadim from shtuya, not the other way around. It says hachikamer menayin shelo nachlok ben mechusar begadim l'shtuya. How do we know there should be no difference between mechusar begadim and shtuya yayin? Talmud lomer chuka l'gzeir shava. So we're really saying now that shtuya yayin and mechusar yadayim b'raglayim are learned out from mechusar begadim. Just like the first pasuk of what Chagar teaching me that a kohen that doesn't have all his begadim is not a kohen, he's a zar, and therefore he would ruin any of the avodas except of course for shchita. He would ruin Kabbalah halacha also. From there, we learn out that shtuya yayin or shlochas reglaim also ruins any of the avodas, not just ones that a zar is chayiv misa on. All right, tomorrow's Gemara we'll pick up from here. Actually, picked it up from a few lines above there. It'll be on the podcast, and on Friday, Mirz Hashem, we'll pick it up. There's on Daf Yud Tes. On the 6th line, there's 2 dots there on Daf Yud Tes Amal from the top, 6 lines from the top of the page. There's 2 dots there. We'll pick it up from there, Mirz Hashem, on Friday. on Isru Chag. So, Slicha Mechila to everybody. I beg Mechila if I offended anybody or hurt anybody in any way. And a Gemar Chasim Tova to everybody.
Mark, see, for everybody, regards to everybody. Should be good in health.